Ray Dalio is a ridiculously successful investor and a businessman. He founded and still runs to this day the largest hedge fund in the world, Bridgewater Associates, and so when he talks, a lot of people like to listen, myself included. No matter what you have to say about his politics or his ideals, his morals, well, you'd have to be a fool to ignore him when he speaks. And just a couple of weeks ago, he went out and gave another interview where he talked about an awful lot of different things. Stagflation in the markets, the situation with our economies as a whole, and a bunch of other things. And even though I disagree with him a lot with what he has to say recently, and with his opinions and the way he thinks about certain issues like China and basic morality, it's always worthwhile taking an argument head on, looking at its merits based on the thing that's being said and not on the person who's saying it. So today I've taken some important things that he said in this interview. I'm going to show them to you, and then I'm going to give a little bit of context and explain just why I think on a couple of issues he's wrong and on some others he's absolutely right.
Are we close to having stagflation?
Yeah, we are in stagflation.
We are. Stagflation is simply where you have inflation, and yet at the same time you have high unemployment.
Yeah, you have economic weakness.
Right.
In other words, you have a stagnant economy. Stagnant, essentially
meaning
means
growth is reduced.
Growth,
right.
Low growth, and with high inflation, and that happens through this monetary situation that I'm describing, in which the central bank tries to deal with a middle course. In other words, what does the central bank want? Not too high inflation and not too low growth. And so when there's a lot of debt, because one man's debts are another man's assets, it becomes very difficult balancing act. And that is when you have stagflation, when you produce it. So just like in the 1960s, late 60s, we spent a lot of money on guns and butter, we called it,
right.
The Vietnam War and social programs and so on. We wrote too many checks relative to the money we had in the bank, which was gold at the time. 1971, the devaluation. Then they print a lot of money into that stagflation. So stagflation is is the middle course when there's two different.
So the Fed and Jay Powell has a balancing act that he has to achieve in order to try to ward off a recession.
Right. So think about it this way. How does he literally fight inflation? Because everybody says tight money policies, and how do you fight inflation? Well, the way that happens is you get people to spend less by taking money and credit away from them.
Right.
So he will reduce the amount of money and credit that's available. The Federal Reserve is going to sell $1.1 trillion of debt that it has, debt assets, bonds. Right. And then they're going to raise interest rates. So they create a squeeze that reduces demand at the same time as people don't have enough money because inflation is high. So that squeeze,
and their buying power is less.
That's right, because inflation is high, the buying power is less. And then what that act is to reduce buying power again, to reduce inflation, but it comes at a big cost, and that is stagflation.
So we start off there with Ray Dalio talking about stagflation, this incredibly scary word, which basically just means a situation where an economy is in decline or stagnating at the same time as there's higher than usual inflation. Now, this is a hot topic right now because there are loads of different investors predicting that the next decade is going to be characterized by stagflation, and there are just as many investors saying that these fears are entirely unwarranted. The problem is, though, Ray Dalio has a point when he says that actually stagflation is already here. The economy is in the process of stagnating. The last quarter, the United States saw negative GDP growth. It actually shrank, and inflation, as I'm sure you know at this point, is monumentally high, and it has been for months on end now. Ray Dalio is right when he says that stagflation is here. What isn't clear, though, and what is still up for debate, is whether or not it's going to be entrenched as we go on forwards into the future. And it's also not clear exactly how the Federal Reserve is going to act to try and halt this stagflation, if that is their goal at all. Now, the problem that Dalio picks up on is that actually it's an incredibly hard thing to fight, and the way to fight it is by destroying demand, by crippling the economy, by making people poorer so that they can't afford to go out and spend their money, and thus we see demand destruction, which brings down inflation. The reason that this is such a big problem is that it involves destroying the economy, and this is during a period where inflation is already high, and so the economy is already struggling, and so, as Dalio says, you get this double whammy of effects where people get hurt twice over.
And what is the moment we're in now? Are we, in your judgment, in a moment in which the world order is going to change?
Yes, we're changing the world order. Okay. In 1945, we started the New World Order. What I mean is, throughout history, there's a fight for control because there's no world court that you go to and plead your case. And so there's a fight for power. So there's a war, and then the winners come out of that war, and the winners set the rules. And so 1945, the United States had 80% of the world's money. Gold was money at the time. It had half the world's GDP. It had a monopoly on military power. So the US set the world order. That's why the United Nations is in New York. Washington, D.C. has the IMF and the World Bank.
And its currency became the reserve currency.
And its currency became the reserve currency because of that set of circumstances. Okay, things evolve, things change, okay, over history. So the three big things that are changing now that haven't occurred in our lifetime is the amount of debt and money creation, which affects the value of money, and you could see it affecting what's going on every day.
Large debt means the printing of money.
Right. The large debt puts central bankers in a choice. Do you pay it back with hard money or do you pay it back with printed devalued money? And if you pay it back with hard money, it's hard. In other words, that's when you have debt crises. So in all cases, they eventually print money and that produces inflation, right? So that dynamics, the first.
And that's the place we are at this moment.
That's the place we are at this moment.
Okay.
And we'll talk about that.
We'll drill down on that
in a minute. The second is when there's a great internal conflict, usually when there's a large wealth and values gap, and at the same time as you have a financial problem. Then you get populism of the left and populism of the right. In other words, those who feel disenfranchised want people who are going to fight for them. They don't want compromisers. They don't want them to be in the middle because middle means that they're not fighting for them. They want them to have guts. So that you have populists of the left and populists
and
of
their
the
positions
right.
harden.
And their positions harden, and there are no compromises. That's why we're potentially in a situation that you could see in one of these elections, maybe in 2024, that neither side would accept losing. Perhaps we see that. You see, maybe you don't follow the rulings of the Supreme Court. Anyway,
that's a serious question today.
So these things have not happened in our lifetime, but they happened many times in history. So if you look at that, you see from those patterns why the gaps become greater and the positions harden, and you see the dynamic. So that's the second. And the third is the rise of a great power to challenge the existing great power. In other words, I gave you the example of the United States was so dominant in 1945. Now it's not as dominant. It is not dominant. In other words, China and the opposition is as strong as the United States and its allies. And so we have a conflict. And there are 5 kinds of wars. And they start in this order, just sequentially, typically. A trade war, a technology war, a geopolitical influence war. Then you get into a capital and economic warfare, which we are now with sanctions. They always happened in history. And then there's a military war. And so you could see that progression happen through time. And that creates a template. So I like to look at the template and then plot dots to see how we're transpiring relative to that template.
Now, following stagflation, Ray Dalio goes on to talk about something that he's characterized the changing world order, and he's spoken about this in the past as well, and it seems to be his main thesis that he's making most of his bets on in this day and age. Now, in a previous video I made a couple of months ago, I went really far deep into detail regarding Ray Dalio's views on this, and I explained his point of view, and so we're just going to touch on this for today and not go too in depth here, but basically, he thinks that China is taking over the world. He thinks that the United States is in decline and that its time as the hegemon of the world is on its last legs, and so it makes perfect sense in his mind to align yourself with China and not with the United States. Now, in short, I think he's wrong on this principle, and I think that, frankly, he's been blinded by money, corrupted by the wealth and power that the Chinese Communist Party has promised him, and as a result of that, he's ignoring vital information that really goes some fair way in proving him wrong. Now, one of his main ideas regarding the changing world order is that as empires die, they start to print money and debase their own currency, and of course, the United States has been printing money incessantly for decades now, and he thinks that this is perfect evidence that actually the US is going on the decline. The problem is, though, he conveniently ignores the fact that China, the hegemon which is supposed to take over the US in his view, is doing the exact same thing. Last week we got news that China was going to be creating and distributing $220 billion worth of bonds in quantitative easing to try and stimulate the economy, doing the exact same thing that the United States has been doing and which Dalio thinks will cause the US's downfall. Dalio also talks about inequality in the United States and how that indicates that actually the US and its empire is on its last legs, but here again he ignores the reality that actually China is an incredibly unequal place as well, and actually in many ways it's even more unequal than the US. There is no democracy in China at all. Power and wealth is incredibly heavily concentrated within the state itself and within those state officials, something that is far more unequal and contributes to far weaker social mobility than the kind of situation we see in the US. But once again, Dalio conveniently ignores these truths. Finally then, we see Dalio pick up on the heightened tensions within the United States itself and how that means that again the US is on its last legs. But again, he conveniently ignores the fact that actually this is happening in the place which is supposed to take over the US at the exact same time. Literally just yesterday, we got news of another run on a bank in China and a whole load of protests and what basically amounts to riots from Chinese citizens as a result of this banking collapse. To make matters worse, unrest in China has actually had a pretty poor record over recent years. Who could forget the massive protests in Hong Kong in which we saw millions of Chinese citizens work against the Communist Party and riot and protest for months on end in an attempt to protect their free speech and their freedoms to democracy. The sad truth is here that Ray Dalio has basically been bought by the CCP. For decades now, since the 1980s, he's been afforded special privileges to invest in the Chinese economy itself, something which really doesn't happen too often with Western investors, and it's made him fabulously rich, and he'd like to continue to get fabulously rich far long into the future, and so the only way he can do this is by aligning himself with the Chinese Communist Party itself. He is corrupted by money, he's corrupted by this allure of power, and so I think it's fair to say that actually he isn't a good faith actor in this situation, and thus he probably isn't reliable when it comes to talking about this issue. Now again, I'm just going to mention briefly that I covered this in the past a couple of months ago in great detail. Dalio put out an almost hour-long video where he explained the entirety of his views, and I went through analysing them, explaining them, and then giving my take on the whole issue as I did here, just with far more to say. And so as always, the link will be down below in the description and the pinned comment if you want to watch that full video to get a lot more context on what's really going on here. If you enjoyed this video, then make sure to like, comment and subscribe to bless the YouTube algorithm. It really does help. If you want to join our exclusive community, then check out our Patreon. You get access to our Discord server and extra content like access to my portfolio and buy and sell alerts for all my own investments. Also, make sure to check out the link in the description to Masterworks. It can help you protect your portfolio against market turmoil through fractional shares of art from world famous artists. Art has historically proven to be uncorrelated to the markets, so it's a really valuable resource with the markets falling every week. There's also a link in the description to I Trust Capital, which helps you to invest in crypto through your tax-advantaged IRA, which could literally save you thousands. If you, like me, think crypto going down is a buy-in opportunity, then now is the perfect time to join I Trust Capital. Thank you all for watching. Stay stoic. Until next time.